Hello, everyone. Welcome to Expo North 2020. We have a very special guest and so many questions in so little time. We have Barrie here, who is the VP of International Formats, Production and Development at NBCUniversal. Hello.
Hi, Jessica. Lovely to meet you.
Thank you so much for joining us from your lockdown to ours. Barrie, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name's Barrie Kelly, and I oversee the international formats production arm for NBCUniversal. And so by overseeing, that means that I would oversee any productions of IP that is owned by NBCUniversal. Those kind of shows, it's unscripted and scripted. Probably the most famous unscripted shows are things like Top Chef, Real Housewives, SNL, but also we do scripted shows as well, like Suits and House, and we reproduce those shows in any international market, so anywhere from any continent or any country.
Wow. So going down to kind of brass tacks basics before we get a little bit more complicated, can you talk about what a format is and how it might translate into?
Sure. A format is, it's built on pillars, I would say. And so what you have is you create a format that does a certain thing at a certain time, or has a character that is very synonymous with that show. And so therefore that is technically its brand. So when you're selling the format as a product, you're selling not only this brand that people can understand and can work within, but also you're kind of selling success to a degree as well, because most formats that sell are of shows that are very successful in their original markets. And so you've kind of got these two things that you come to the market with: really great ideas, a structure that's very simple to follow, that can be adapted anywhere, but also a very successful format and show itself. So those are really the two key things you need to sell a format.
Brilliant. When you look at taking a format and bridging it internationally, do you have a preconceived idea of what formats work where, or are you approached by companies who are familiar with different shows, who are like, we would like to?
Well, so I work within a team. So I oversee the production side, but there are salespeople all over the world who kind of look after different continents for NBCUniversal. And they absolutely know their markets and what works and what doesn't work. But, you know, being in production and being across production across all of those different continents, you do get a sense of what works where. And in Asia, you know, you're looking more at your kind of game show, quite fun entertainment programming. In Europe, you kind of, you know, have everything, but it's interesting that factual entertainment, you know what I mean by factual entertainment, more less studio-led shows, formats would sell well into Europe. And that's become a big part of the format business. And then obviously you've got the US and North America, which is our home, where we get a lot of our shows from. And, you know, the US do everything in such an incredible way. Everything's so big and large. And what my job is to make sure that we can scale those really big, ambitious ideas and scale them down so people around the world can afford to make those shows. So that's a really big part of what I have to do, and work very closely with the US teams and convey that to the channels and international producers who make the shows.
God, that's amazing. Can you give some examples, some kind of examples of shows that have done that?
Well, in terms of our shows, probably the biggest format that we have is a show called Top Chef, which is not currently in the UK. I don't know if who's seen this around the world, but it is probably one of the most successful food talent challenge shows there is. You know, and in the US, and I would say this, but it is deemed the best show, and it's deemed the best show by the Emmy awards unit as well, so it always gets nominated for awards. And Top Chef does follow that Master Chef model, you know, in that you have these kind of challenges that chefs do, and there's usually an elimination process and win at the end. The difference being Master Chef is for amateurs and Top Chef is for professionals.
Yeah.
And I think that is what makes it kind of makes it more interesting for me, because it means the challenges can be harder and they can be asked to do things. And in terms of tailoring that show internationally, it's really interesting to localize it, you know. And I think the most successful shows are the shows where you kind of take your format, you put it down in the territory, and you say, right, we do this, but what we want is a local flavor. And with Top Chef, because it's very cuisine led, you can really offer that local flavor to all these shows. So the Top Chef France is insanely successful. So that's on an M6 in France at the moment. Series 11 was one of the most successful ratings ever. But we do it in Top Chef Thailand, Top Chef Vietnam. Again, the budgets are smaller, but the ethos of the show is the same. Everyone is so invested and believes in the passion of the show, and the challenges can be recreated, but you just have to kind of maybe not have as many cameras, or your shooting time is less, or your set isn't as big. And so in a way, that's how you save your costs. You know, you kind of look at all these elements, but you don't want to rip out the heart of the show. So we do it in Asia, we do it in LATAM, we do Top Chef Brazil, has a kind of Big Brother style house attached to it. We do it all over Europe. So we've kind of, you know, we've really crossed many different boundaries with that show.
Do you know, I can imagine too, when you're looking to translate these things, you know, there's the practical sense of scale and cost. And then there's also, you're so aware of storytelling, there's also those themes where food's universal. I mean, seeing people being really good at what they do is also, that joy is universal. Is scripted harder in the sense of being able to scale things?
Scripted is tougher to sell the format. You know, you don't have as many scripted format sales as unscripted format sales, because usually, you know, with a scripted show, you're taking a show that's probably very well known. So for example, something like, we produced Suits in Asia. So we've got Suits Japan and Suits Korea that were very successful, that have kind of aired over the last couple of years. So you have your own kind of Korean Harvey and Mike, and your own Japanese. So you have those characters. But the way the scripted format business works is that usually when people buy a scripted format, they buy the scripts. You know, the scripts are written, the characters have been created. Hopefully all of the hard work has been done. And what international producers have to do is they have to recreate those scripts and localize it. Again, localizing is very important. So for example, in Korea for Suits, there's a very key, I don't know if anyone can cast their mind back to Ep1, Series 1 of Suits.
Oh yes, I could.
You can. Well, there's a very key storyline where Mike, the first time he meets Harvey, he's kind of carrying a bag of drugs. And that's because he's doing this kind of drug deal. And in Korea, obviously, that is a no-no when it comes to content. You can't really kind of go into that area. And so we had to tweak that and kind of not make it about drugs, but he kind of walked in, and I can't remember exactly how we did it, but we kind of had to change those storylines. And so you have to make those little tweaks to make the show work for that territory. But the style, the look, and again, you know, it goes back to that branding. I think shows have a brand. The big formats, you know, when you see them on screen anywhere in the world, made by whichever country, you know what that show is. And that is about the branding of the show. So it's so we kind of did it. It's no formats is easy, I'll be honest with you. Recreating a format show anywhere in the world is tough. Everyone will say that, whoever works in the business. But it's scripted, I think, is a little bit trickier in that respect.
Do you know, this feels like beautiful alchemy in the sense that you're asking what's the real essential mechanics of the show that make it the show itself, and then what can be locally specific so that it speaks to that particular culture and the nuances in that culture. It's a really kind of a magic kind of storytelling that you're doing.
It is, and I think, you know, that's the constant. You know, I think it is all about, you know, we all make shows where, you know, story is everything. You know, every show, every format that you make, and we kind of cover we do game shows, we do constructor reality shows, we do talent competitions, we do live comedy sketch shows. They all have a story. They all have a, you know, usually an ABC storyline, which everyone can follow, which you would have in any scripted show. But you'd have that in a game show. You know, if someone wins a certain amount of money, they've won a certain amount of money for a reason, and they've kind of gone through these ups and downs to get there.
Yeah.
So during a show, so whatever happens, you're always looking at stories. And also, I think what I'm passionate about is kind of taking stories and lifting them from one culture to another.
Oh,
I think that is, it's fascinating, and I think it's something that is absolutely, you know, it's becoming more prevalent. It's becoming more important. You know, you look at the world as a whole is affected at the moment by what's going on, and I think everyone's going to be telling similar stories and can talk to each other. You know, and I think that's when it comes to formats. You know, we go and make a show, and we kind of want to tell a slightly different story, but you know, the story is accessible to every audience, and I think that's
fabulous.
My passion when it comes to formats.
Were there anything along the way that you're learning that's surprising, hard, or easy about translating stories?
It's not, I wouldn't say easy, but I would say that there are you know, the universal themes. You are kind of actually, I tell you what, I'll backtrack a little bit there. I think the thing that I'm always impressed by, and I think this is something my background, I used to work for the BBC for many years in production, and so in the UK, you know, we're all very proud of what we do, and are, you know, without a doubt, one of the best producers in the world. You know, I think I'm sure people say we are the best, but I am always impressed by the amount of skills everywhere in the world. You know, I've worked on productions in everywhere from Indonesia to El Salvador to Iceland. So you kind of take all of these countries, and I'm always so impressed by how fantastic all of these production teams are in recreating these formats with a minuscule of the budgets. And so that is something I'm always impressed by. And therefore that kind of makes my job a little easier, because you've got so many talented people working on the shows. So you don't have to go in and kind of go, oh my God, this isn't going to work. What's hard is, you know, I think it's getting harder and harder to sell shows. You know, there's less money out there. There's less, broadcasters don't have as much money to kind of take risks. You know, and I think with formats, what we try and do is we try and say, look, we're trying to sell success, you know, so therefore the broadcaster doesn't need to take the risk, because we know it works, and hopefully it will work in your territory. The one other thing that I think is always important is that we're looking to develop shows. And so one other part of my job is developing shows. So I develop shows, we do co-development deals with all kinds of channels and broadcasters. So we've just done a co-development deal with a Japanese broadcaster, where we co-developed a kind of hidden camera game show called the Secret Game Show.
That process of co-developing, it's so collaborative. What does that look like when you're co-developing?
Well, it's just taking the Japanese example. Look, you know, we work with ABC Asahi in Japan, and it was we'd have a regular 2-week call where we talk through the idea, and we kind of have action points off the back of those calls. But we, you know, the original idea was mine, and so I kind of mentioned the idea to them, and then they kind of took it and said, well, what about if we did this? And you put it in a Japanese. The show is based in offices and workplaces around the country, and you have to play the game show. So they kind of gave it its own identity. So it's been a fascinating process. But again, you always come down to the fact that, you know, everyone that works in TV has the same sensibility, has the same knowledge, and you have that connection with them. And so we're all the same, and we all have a bond. And that's why the development process really works. And it's probably one of the most rewarding parts of my job, actually, I would say.
Barrie, that's so fantastic. It must make the world feel a little bit closer. The fact that you get to collaborate.
It's a very, very small world. You know, it really is. You know, everywhere you go, every TV studio in the world is kind of the same. You know, it's kind of like you could be in a TV studio anywhere. So
I find that very comforting.
It is. It's very comforting. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. And can I ask, any of the new technologies that also connect people through media, like TikTok, YouTube, does that jog your brain at all in terms of being like, oh, clearly those stories are rippling in these different cultures, and or not really?
Yeah, I think what we're trying at the moment now, you know, the formats business has usually been quite an old-fashioned business, in that, you know, you would sell a show to a big broadcaster, it goes on free to air, and it gets success, and therefore you take that everywhere. Whereas I think now, because there are so many different platforms, you know, YouTube and TikTok perhaps aren't there when it comes to creating the content, especially in the unscripted space.
Yeah.
But you have the S4 platforms, you have Quibi, you have all of these
Yeah.
different platforms that we're now looking at how we can incorporate formats into those different platforms. So format is evolving. You're still with format, you're still having to sell some success. And so how you measure that success on TikTok and YouTube is by views, but again, it's not. I don't necessarily think people are coming to those platforms to see formats. YouTube is very successful doing what it does. TikTok is the same.
Exactly.
So it's whether we're kind of at that. I'm not saying it won't happen, but whether we're there right now is I would probably say no.
And I have to mention the COVID elephant in the room, although everyone's sick of talking about it. Are there any, I guess, more positive way of looking at it, are there any benefits or coping strategies that you guys have found that are going to be takeaways from this particular time?
I think one thing that I think everyone has experienced from COVID is this need to reconnect. Everyone's reconnecting, whether it's friends you haven't seen for a long time, whatever. We can do it via this, this process here. But I think one thing I've been doing is, we have Top Chef and Real Housewives made in many different countries, and we try and join all the production companies, execs together on Zoom calls where everyone can talk about what they're doing and how they want to get everything up and running. And I think again, it's that, that's something we've never done before. And this situation we're in now has kind of meant that, look, actually we should be doing this. We should all be helping each other get back into production. So, it's created those bonds, which I think is quite interesting, and hopefully they will last past this, and we'll do that more regularly. So I think that's been quite a positive thing from.
Barrie, that's really wonderful, because I have to say, being entertained and hearing good stories, especially stories that can bridge cultures and create a shared experience around the world, is something we really need and are relying on when we're in lockdown. So thank you for the work you do. Can you leave us with a little bit of advice before we go?
Yes, and I think you did ask me this, and I kind of thought, oh God, what advice can I give you? The only advice I would ever give is, and I didn't, my life, my career, I've kind of worked in radio, I've worked in TV, I've worked in the international formats business. I think, and now we're in a situation where, life may not be the same after all of this. And I think my advice that someone always gave me, which is something I've thought, is never be afraid of change. Never be afraid of change. But because I think you will always, if you change your job or change what you're doing or finesse some aspect of your career to focus on something, it will usually end up being a beneficial thing for you, and you'll end up becoming a better producer or a better person at the end of it. So I think that's something that I think is probably any advice I would give.
That is fantastic advice. Scary, but fantastic advice.
Scary advice. Yeah, I didn't say it was. No, it's scary. I'm scared, more scared than anyone. But I think that is it's very important to never be afraid of it.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's wonderful. Barrie, thank you so much for joining us. Again, so many more questions, but maybe a part 2 because we've run out of time today. Thank you for joining us.
No worries. My pleasure. Thank you, Jessica.